In Chapter 16, Section 3, Monetary Policy Tools, we will be discussing 3 tools that are used for monetary policy. These tools help keep the economy growing, stay out of a depression, and not hit high inflation rates. So let's get started with these different tools. First thing we're talking about is money creation. This is how money that's printed enters into the economy, known as circulation. The Federal Reserve puts on banks something called an RRR, which is a required reserve ratio. So what that means is that this rate determines how much money the banks need to have on hand at all times, or at the start of a business day. With this, let's say that the government requires 10% of all the money that is a part of that bank to be collected and keep in the bank locally. And let's say that there's $1,000 that are at this bank. So it's a very, 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 very tiny bank that we have here. So at a 10% reserve ratio rate of $1,000, the bank would have to have $100 in cash on hand. So this is one way that the Federal Reserve can control the amount of money that's in circulation. We have something called the money multiplier. In the homework assignment, you will find how to calculate the money multiplier. Now for this, what this means is that whenever money goes into the economy, there's a multiplier effect. So let's say that $1,000 is printed by the Federal Reserve and deposited into the banking system. What we would find is that this would not just be $1,000. It would actually have a multiplication effect, which result in a type of growth. So if the government wanted to get the economy going, they could put $10 million, and it wouldn't just be $10 million going to the company. It would be millions upon millions of dollars, because there is this trickle-down effect that works. If a bank has more than the required reserve rate, this is known as excess reserves. This means that they have a greater amount than what is required by the Federal Reserve. So the first tool that we're going to focus on is the required reserve ratio money supply. And what we find with this one is that if this line is considered equilibrium, and let's say the equilibrium rate is, let's say it's 15%. We're at equilibrium. The economy is doing well. On both ends, it's going fine. But what happens if we find that the economy is heading towards a recession? So if we find it's heading towards a recession, that means that there is less money available. So what they could actually do is increase or decrease the amount of required reserve ratio by the banks. Give me a second here. So what that means is that banks no longer have to have that 15%. They only have to keep 10% in the banks at all times, which means that there's going to be an additional 5% cash available that banks can then cash out and use for loans. So again, if we're at equilibrium at 15%, the economy begins to slow down and starts to head to recession, the Federal Reserve can tell the banks, okay, you no longer have to have 15% of all the cash available in your bank, you only need to have 10%, which means now they can lend out 5% more of all the money supply that they have. Well, let's say we go the other route, and in this route, we are heading towards high inflation. What the Federal Reserve could do on this end is they could actually increase the amount of the reserve ratio, meaning that the banks need to hold on to more cash than what they normally would. So if it's at 15% and let's say inflation is getting out of hand, the Reserve can jump in and say, okay, all the banks that are out there that are members, you now have to hold on to 20% of your cash rather than 15%. This will actually slow down the economy, making less money available, which will increase the interest rates. So the required reserve ratio is a great tool that can be used by the Federal Reserve to keep the money flow within the economy going one way or the other. So one last time, if 15% is the equilibrium, if we start heading towards recession, we want to decrease this ratio, which means there'll be more money available for the banks to lend out. If we're heading towards inflation, then we want the reserve ratio to increase, which means there'll be less money available in the economy, which means that banks can't give out as much on that end. So this is one great tool that the Federal Reserve can use. The next one is known as the prime rate. A prime rate is the best rate that is available for the top customers available at banks. So people with a very, very high credit score, banks or corporations that have a high credit score, they get something known as a prime lending rate. And you may have heard that when it comes to the economy or mortgage rates or something similar to that. This is known as a prime lending rate. So that means that the best of the best, their interest rates are the lowest. This can also be changed. Same situation. If we find the economy is growing too slow, well then the prime lending rate, this prime rate, can be lowered, which is then going to encourage customers to come into the bank to take out more loans. If the interest rate is lower, people are more often to buy bigger things such as vehicles and boats and houses because of the lower interest rate. But if the prime rate increases, that is a result because inflation is too high, and so we need to slow down the amount of money that's being lent out, and by doing that, increase the interest rates, which will slow down the amount of large purchases. So again, this is another tool that can be used to control the economy from growing too fast or growing too slow. The most common tool that we find here is actually the open market operations. The Federal Reserve really doesn't mess around with the reserve ratio too much, prime rate not so much either. But open market bonds operations is where they focus their time on. And this is important to determine what needs to be done. So this is where we have buying and selling government securities in order to alter the supply of money. We're going to use bonds, for instance, for this. So let's say that there is this pool of bonds that are out there. It's either owned by the Federal Reserve or they're owned by these private banks, these member banks. And if the economy is slowing down, well then what's going to take place is the Federal Reserve is going to increase the amount of bonds that they're purchasing from the member banks. The member banks then get the cash that they just sold off the bonds, which means now they have more cash available to be able to sell out or provide more loans using the cash that's now available. But on the flip side, if the economy is heading towards inflation growing too fast, the Federal Reserve will require its members' banks to purchase these bonds back, which means now they'll have less money available to them, which means that they'll be able to provide less loans, which means that people can't buy as many things, which will result in inflation being dropped. So again, in a nutshell, what I just said there, if the economy is not growing fast enough, the Federal Reserve will buy bonds from the member banks, which will then give them cash to give out more loans. On the flip side, if the economy is growing too fast, then the Federal Reserve, the bonds they've just purchased, will now be sold back to the banks, and those banks will have less money to send out loans, which will slow down the economy, which should hopefully avoid an inflation rate increase. So these were a couple different tools there: the required reserve ratio, the prime rates, and the open market operations. This is the end of Chapter 16, Section 2.